kick off. Hi, everybody. We're going to be chatting for the next hour, looking at Britain on strike. Has the government lost control? Why we're looking at this today? Because we're in a situation where nurses, paramedics, railway workers, train drivers, teachers, court staff, civil servants, bus drivers, university lecturers, border force, physios joined in today with their own one-day walkout across England. But all of these sectors are staging strike action across the UK. It's been going on for months and it doesn't look as though it's showing any signs of stopping. So the question is, as the cost of the UK economy is estimated around 6 billion and counting, how has the government responded? How have the unions responded? Do the unions still have the same kind of clout that they used to? Are comparisons with the winter of discontent overblown? How does the UK maybe compare to some other countries that are staging strike action? Does that give us any lessons over how the UK government should respond? Is there a way that this ends in the sort of near term? And the goal of the whole thing is to try and come up with some ideas of how Tortoise should cover it. What is the way that we can cut through and tell the story in our way, whether that's through Sensemaker Tops or through slow newscasts or through Sensemakers or through a ThinkIn event or any other ideas that people might have. So those are a few things kind of on my mind to kick the hour off. But can I just get a quick gauge of how many people know someone who is on strike or who is planning to? Brilliant. Can I get some people? Liz, can you feed in on who you know and why they're striking?
I know, obviously there are teachers in my son's school, but I know a nurse, a senior nurse, who is striking, or has struck, if that makes sense.
And where does she work?
At a big London hospital.
Okay. And is this over, what's kind of why? Has there been talk of strike before, or what's led to this point that she thinks enough is enough?
She's a member of the Royal College of Nurses, and they did the ballot, and she voted to strike, and then she was, I think there's been 2 nurses strikes, haven't there? And I think the first one she didn't, and the second one she did, but because in the first one she works in critical care, so she was one of the people that was rotated on to do the minimum care level, and then the second one she wasn't. They sort of tried to manage it across their rotated team so that it was sort of even who worked and who didn't, kind of thing.
And does she feel that the strike action is sort of cutting through in terms of putting pressure on the government in the way that they want it to, or do they feel that it's getting them?
I don't know. I don't know if they feel it is or isn't. I think I haven't spoken to her about that specific thing. My sense is that the nursing profession in general is at the end of its tether and has been for some time.
Yeah.
And so their optimism, I think the RCN is trying to keep them optimistic for reasons of managing morale. They did receive a letter, this isn't quite strike related, but they did receive a letter that told them, I think it went to all the matrons. Okay. Now, did it come from I think it came from the RCN, and it went to all the matrons, and the letter said, we know that you will have to do things, not related to the strike, but related to in general, you will have to do things that you find unpalatable. Unpalatable was the word. Okay. We're writing to you to say, we've got your back, but you are just going to have to do it because that's the situation we're in, and that's why we're having to fight the fight.
What did that mean, unpalatable? As in, what were they?
It's unsafe.
Okay.
So that it was a kind of action of the union to say, we understand that you are in an impossible situation, and we're here to say that when the inevitable happens, which it will do, we're not turning away from you, kind of thing.
Thank you. Who can I get a couple more people diving in if they know someone who's maybe from a different sector?
My mum, she's a teacher, so she's going on strike, I think in London and in England, the strike days. And
can you talk, why, what are the motivations for her, what she's sort of saying about it?
I think the pay is the real issue. Conditions, expectations, scrutiny, a whole host of issues.
Is this over, because this isn't just pay for this year, right? This is sort of long-term, real-term pay cuts that I think teachers we saw, what was the figure for teachers? Like, it's gone down by sort of 7%, I think, in real terms?
Yeah.
Over 10 years. So is that what she's feeling, that it's time, that enough's enough?
I think so. Yeah, it's just, yeah, I see my mum really stressed all the time, and it's just taking its toll. Yeah, and I think the unions have been quite supportive, so yeah, that's the experience I've got.
Okay, thank you. One more before we... Who else? There were quite a lot of hands before.
Mine's just my brother, who's not a doctor, a teacher in Gloucestershire, and he's very much in the same sort of situation, just finding it very, very difficult to fund his life with cost of living and real terms pay cuts, as well as just the overstretching of teachers having to deal with the workload of trying to get secondary school kids through GCSEs when they've just missed a year or so of education in school, having to do all sorts of catch-up extra lessons and interventions, as they call them, to help kids, which often is working extra time, which he wants to do for the sake of the kids, but it's not. It doesn't get anything else on his pay packet for doing it.
Okay, thank you. And of how many people have been impacted by a strike so far? In some, and then generally, how many people are still supportive of these sectors taking strike action? Okay, so far, despite a lot of people feeling it, it doesn't make a difference. Okay, great. At this point, Phoebe, do you want to jump in with the...
Yeah,
we've got some slides to go through.
Which is fun because they're behind me.
Yep.
So we've done a bit of a run through, and to be honest, thanks to the FT, they did a pretty good piece and did some ONS analysis, and then we've kind of taken our own version of it. But so this is, so the way this is kind of worked out is gross annual pay change. So the 80 to 140 on the side, that's kind of where the starting point, which is in 2011. And then you can kind of see, so the kind of interesting thing to note is that kind of quite nice diagonal of all workers, university lecturers falling off a cliff, who have also just agreed to do more strike action. They've been striking for a long time, as I'm sure anyone here who was recently a student will know. Nurses, kind of slow peak, so they didn't have the data for 2020 to 2022, as per for doctors. The suggestion was that you can accept that would fall down, obviously in 2022, real pay, so that's not accounting for inflation, especially doctors. You can see it completely fall off a cliff down below. So that's a kind of good thing. And then obviously train and tram drivers kind of actually above all workers in terms of increase in pay, but you can see that kind of flattening, which is kind of the problem at the moment. So in comparison to inflation, it is kind of flattened out.
Giles had a question.
Has a question.
Did you say that those numbers are not adjusted for inflation?
So no, it's just doctors and nurses, the data stops in 2020. So it's not going to have the Ukraine war.
So all that is real terms pay adjusted for inflation?
Yeah.
And then next slide.
Hang on, sorry, I have a question.
Yeah.
Yes, sorry.
Does that indicate then, did you just infer from that trade drivers and tram drivers are better at negotiating pay deals than everybody else?
Potentially. I think it also, within that, it doesn't show that some of them are paid quite well, and part of the train's strikes is also on safety, so obviously that doesn't take into account safety or number of workers or the amount of people that have been laid off for other reasons. So it's a line, and it doesn't
Just
really...
on that point on negotiating pay, I did read that ASLEF, which is the train drivers union specifically, they negotiated a 28.5% pay rise over 5 years in 2017, and that's when inflation was at 2.8%.
Yeah.
So they've got a good history
They
of
are.
that.
It's basically a closed shop, the train drivers, isn't it?
Yeah.
And they've I mean, you remember they
you can't
striked a lot
you know,
around night train coming in, the night tube coming in, and you know, I mean, whereas doctors and nurses, historically, this is very unusual.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So-
Nurses have never gone on strike.
And then
In this way.
with the university, because you said university lecturers, sorry.
Car crash.
Good job I don't work in the live team. But, so you said that they've been striking quite a lot.
Yeah.
Do you mean over the past sort of 3 or 4 years?
No, beyond that. So there was I mean, this is anecdotal and I can check it, but before 2015.
Fine. So does that indicate? So I guess I'm sort of asking the same question then of why hasn't it worked for them?
Their dispute was over pensions.
Their dispute's pension focused, not pay focused, and now they've included pay. So
You could tell I know nothing about this.
no, but so UCU is a really interesting example that maybe is worth thinking about. They are one, they take a considerable amount of strike time. I from memory as well, 2 weeks in total. So that will just take an entire week where there is no university teaching. Obviously, students get involved. The picket lines are quite active. Billy Bragg turned up to my student picket line, but this was in 2016. And then, yeah, I think pensions is a big part of it, PhD pay and how they kind of negotiate at the same time as universities asking for more money, which is, yeah. And then this is specifically nurses, so this is OECD data. So you can see Australia kind of hitting at the top. Netherlands has taken a bit of a dive, but still Belgium quite consistent. The US kind of sits about here. That's the green. France is the orange. Again, so kind of a middle ground, has gone down slightly. And then the UK right down near the bottom. So if you want a good comparison about how basically the point from this is nurses have a point. In terms of pay in comparison to other kind of major developed countries. And then the next one. So this is kind of this upcoming strike action. So, and this is kind of about 400,000 workers, give or take. It's quite hard to always pick that up. So today is ambulance staff, specifically Northern Ireland, I believe, physiotherapists, bus drivers, teachers in Scotland. 1st of February, put it in your diaries, civil servants, teachers, train drivers, which is ASLEF, unless anything changes, university staff. 6th of Feb will be Nurses England ambulance staff, and then 7th of Feb also slightly less, but it's also that's midwives in Wales, which is might be joined by midwives in England at some point. So although they've not said coordinated strike action for the nurses and ambulance staff, it is coordinated strike action. The 1st of Feb is coordinated strike action. They've specifically targeted TUC's calling it a day of kind of protest. They're expecting what they want is France, which we'll come to in a minute. And then the next slide. Just do this really quickly. So this is a kind of comparison of responses. This was Mick Lynch last year for The Guardian, which I think is a pretty good summation of his viewpoint from the RMT. You don't think strikes are the answer. What is? I don't think we've really moved on from that. And then this is kind of a good, which we can come to, Jess, as well, is this standard response. The disappointing is the word to note. You'll kind of notice it and pick up on it. The standard response from ministers, from spokespersons, from Rishi Sunak is, it's disappointing that union members are striking, which is, I think, an interesting turn of phrase. And then finally, for a bit of fun, this is
for this.
A picture from the French strikes last week where over 400,000 marched to Paris, 200 cities had strike action, millions walked out, Black Thursday, day of chaos. And then this is, if you can't quite see it, this is the tram lines, and then they've got a moving barbecue with hot dogs on it that runs along with the strike action as they protest. That is a level of organisation.
They know what they're doing.
What a time to be alive. But that's important to say that this is different because this is proposed pension reforms, which is a long problem in France, and that affects all workforces. Whereas the ones in the UK are very, although pay is in general, there are specific complaints. This is specifically will affect everyone who is looking to retire. So slightly different issue. But I think this is what they kind of are looking for, level-wise.
That's what we're aiming for.
Well, maybe not the sausages, but you know what I mean.
No, I'm aiming for the sausages.
Join a union if I got a barbecue.
So that's the slides. It'd be interesting to know if anyone's got any other questions about them.
Giles.
Who's doing the coordinating?
So last summer, Mick Lynch called for it, and the reason coordinated strike action rather than general strike is being used is complicated, but I think he called for it, it wasn't much appetite, and then I don't know if you remember, I went to that UCU strike that was at Euston Station, and then that was joined by Mick Lynch, it was joined by Unison, a group of others, and then all the leaders came up, and the leader from Unite said something along the lines of coordinated strike action. Yeah, so she said coordinated strike action, and now it's become kind of parlance, and I think, you know, it is a way to have more significant impact, it does make a difference to the way the media covers it, I can imagine as well, you know, rather than, it's quite easy when it's like picking over certain days, and physiotherapists in Wales going on strike isn't going to splash. Everyone kind of going on strike on the same day obviously has more of an impact.
Yeah, I'm just thinking from story point of view.
Yeah.
Is there a war room? Is there a person, not
That's a
Mick
good
Lynch,
question.
who's somewhat overexposed, but who we could get alongside?
Yeah.
Would that be someone like, for the nurses,
It'd be
with
someone
Pat
from the
Cullen type, or
TUC.
someone more someone more backroom?
Nursing is kind of keeping their distance from it a little bit, from what I can see, but the TUC, Unite, Unison, yeah. It'll be those war rooms, I can imagine.
Try and get in a war room.
To what extent do the changes that came in under Margaret Thatcher, etc., which strictly controlled the balloting of members, etc., how do they affect unions' ability to coordinate with each other? Because there was I remember at that time there was a lot of, you know, various. One union wasn't allowed to go and support another union because that was all flying pickets, etc., etc. And I know that the controls that or the restrictions that are put on unions to allow them to strike are much more severe in the UK than they are in a lot of Europe, especially France.
It's a good question.
It's one I don't have an answer to actually, but it's one we can look at in terms of what impact that has had on their ability to stage strikes today.
Yeah, because I mean the French very much, you know, they revolt.
So interesting that they
revolt at every
They only have to give
opportunity
48 hours notice,
Exactly.
whereas we have to give 2 weeks notice. Like, so even things like that are significant.
You've got to have a 50% threshold, don't you, as well?
50% threshold, and then of that threshold, 40%. There's 2 thresholds. So, for example, Royal College of Midwives for England missed it by 1%. Just because, and that was because of the postal strikes, partly.
Thanks for that.
Is there something in looking at, like, because if this is the first batch of, or first collection of strike action that we've had, like, on a regular basis for quite some time, is there anyone in charge who actually has experience of negotiating with unions? Do you know what I mean? Like, I sort of imagine in the 80s, if you were a minister in charge of, I don't know, transport, you probably kind of got a few hours of negotiation under your belt, and like, is there anyone who's any good at it?
Negotiating with the unions.
When Chris Grayling was Transport Secretary, when there was the night tube stuff. No, I was sort of talking to Jess and Phoebe about this before, about the sort of rhetoric that we saw during the leadership contest over the summer, which was they clearly knew that this was coming, right? It was that kind of slow-moving Austin Powers, no, here comes the winter of discontent. And so they sort of started pitch rolling for what they were hoping would be a Thatcher versus the miners type moment. But I think the differences are both that the unions don't have the stranglehold on the economy that they did have in the 70s and 80s, partly because of the various restrictions that have been put on them.
And union membership's fallen so much. It's just not as...
But it's, I mean, chicken and egg, I think. But also because, as we've just seen from the hands going up in this room, although people are being inconvenienced at best, in some cases, you know, it's obviously a much more serious impact. There is still broad support for people because we've all kind of lived through the last decade or so of austerity, and all of us have kind of recognised that salaries aren't going up as much as we would have liked and so on. And it's sort of, you know, quite stark when you actually see that graph was a really interesting one. And I'd be interested to see not just all workers, but those on the minimum wage as well, because of course we had the Amazon strike this week as well.
Yeah.
And, you know, when you look at people are on £10 an hour and Jeff Bezos is flying into space, I think that's, again, another one where people can think, no, hang on a minute, maybe pay your lowest paid staffers a bit more, you know.
Yeah.
So I think sentiment and sort of
power,
the reality that it's not as widespread as it was when it was the first winter of discontent kind of mean that they're not winning the hearts and minds that they thought they might?
Because it seems... Sorry, I will come to you in a sec. But it seems like as you say, this isn't a winter of discontent for exactly those reasons, but the government seems to be treating it as though it is, and it's very much us versus them. Which we were also talking about, we're going to break the unions.
And it's Labour's.
And it's... Exactly. So, but how long can they... If, as you say, if public sentiment stays with the people striking, at what point does the government have to change tack and acknowledge that Sunak isn't Thatcher and that that strategy is not going to work?
I think one of the big things is bin men are still picking up the bins, and I think well, in Scotland I think that was a big issue actually.
COP last year.
And Edinburgh Fringe.
So that's a really good point, because COP last year, that was a well-timed strike. There was piles and piles of rubbish all around Glasgow for COP and rats running around, and then they changed them, and that was a good way to negotiate. I'm not suggesting that, but
it's the bin men that'll break it.
They got what they wanted.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
Liz, sorry.
Probably people have already said it better, but I don't know, has the government lost control? Yeah, the unions don't have the economy in stranglehold because, to a large extent, the government are the people that have the economy in stranglehold by the choices they're making. The question more is, has the government lost the plot? Because the politics of it that we've just been talking about don't add up to me, and the economics of it also don't add up to me. I don't know, but I read Martin Wolf and he sort of does know, and neither thing works. So your question, I think, about public sentiment is holding in favour of the striking workers because everybody's feeling it, even if you're not in one of the sectors that we've seen affected so far. So how long? But that's my question. I can't imagine this government going, OK, fine, you can have the money. You've got us. You guys. They're not going to do that. So is it that they'll just dig in because they're going to lose anyway in 2024, 2025.
And then it becomes Labour's problem, and that's a political thing they then hand to them. So what's your plan?
What's your plan? I don't know.
I think they're waiting for inflation to come down.
Which it will anyway, but prices don't go down when inflation goes down. I keep saying this to everyone. The prices are still going up. They're just going up less.
No, exactly. Yeah, but it's easier for them to say, we're not going to give you a 15% pay rise when they say inflation's 5%. Because people don't understand that. I think there's a lack of financial literacy that may be part.
But yeah, because it's the inflation that makes the real wages go down like this. Not changing. I don't know.
Can we pass the mic over to Joe?
Which one?
Thanks, Phoebe.
One of the things I noticed from the graphs earlier on, that there was almost a sort of correlation between those working in the health services, doctors, nurses, ambulances, by how badly they've been treated in terms of pay awards in comparison to the rail, etc. But then it's much more difficult for doctors, nurses, etc. to go on strike because obviously the health consequences on the public. So it's, they're sitting on a knife edge where they can, if they go on strike for too long or with too much effect, they lose public support. Whereas train drivers can sit at home and leave no trains running without a huge amount of collateral damage to people's health, at least. And I wonder whether there's really any kind of correlation or whether it just looks like it.
Carly.
I can answer that a bit.
All right, good.
Yes, we can talk. Maybe do you want to talk about the anti-strike clause?
Yes,
that's part of it.
Let's do that.
So this is this minimum service level, minimum safety level, which would be interesting to know what people think and what they've heard and how they understand it. Because Rishi Sunak came out and said the International Labour Organization, they approve of minimum service levels. So this is just having enough staff so that people aren't. It's not to say people aren't, so for the ambulances, it's we respond to certain categories of calls. For the nurses, it's minimum level of people. For the midwives, they're going to make sure there's enough people on board. So if you're having a baby, then it's okay. But his comparison was with the rest of Europe, but we've just done a bit of kind of research on that, and minimum service levels are very, very varying. And necessarily the ILO actually says that it shouldn't be mediated by government. It should be mediated by an independent person working with the unions, working with government, and then maybe, if you're necessary, take it to court. But what they don't suggest, which this new bill coming through Parliament is committee stage now, is that you would sue or sack workers for not complying with minimum safety. France, Italy, but they don't have that. That's a severe movement forward. That's not to say it's going to become law. Kat seemed to think
it might. So
Yes.
it sounds like it's going to go up to the Lords in February.
Yeah.
The Lords are likely going to push it back, but they may have limited amount that they can do to change it, because they know that they're not in the greatest of positions at the moment in terms of public support.
But I think if that's it, I would be interested to know if anyone's like, that's my fear with nurses, because there's a reason police aren't allowed to strike, for example. But the argument from the nursing
unions
unions
are already saying they'll challenge it in the courts if it goes through. It's
So
being described as unworkable and unenforceable.
in terms of what we could do with that, so why? I know we were talking about this earlier. I was looking at ThinkIn. So I think we've only done one vaguely strike-related ThinkIn apart from this one, which was the airport chaos one. Do you remember that you did, Giles, last summer with
Simon Corbett.
Yeah, because it wasn't just strikes, was it? It was airports just falling apart generally. But apart from that, we don't cover it very much. Unless I've missed something blindingly
Have we done
obvious.
We haven't done any slow newscasts or...
Done you not? We didn't.
We did, yeah. We did
So given it's such a big thing, why is it? I don't know.
I think that's because
What's
I think
the
it's...
objection to it? Does it get suggested? Why don't we? I don't know. So I'm looking at you because.
No, I was just talking near me. What was the question?
Well, why don't we seem to cover strikes very much, in our stuff?
I think it's because for about 33 years they've not dominated politics. I'm old enough to remember Winter of Discontent, 79, Maggie takes over, there's a full-on war, there's the miners' strike, and there's a result, and the Tories win. And I'm no expert, but it feels like they've been picking themselves up and remarshalling their power ever since. And they are still not. This is why I was asking earlier about who's doing the coordinating and whether that is a way into the story. Because in the old days, the BBC's industrial relations editor was like the most overexposed reporter in the country, and every night at 10 o'clock or whenever it was, 9 o'clock then, you'd go to in front of the TUC building, which is just around the corner here. None of that happens now. It's all atomized. Even this is why I wonder if behind the scenes there is a war room. Anyway.
And if there isn't, what does that say about chances of success?
Yeah, and the other thing is that, I mean, thinking about that from the purposes of a slow newscast, which isn't my bailiwick, but for a sense maker, we have to do the what and we have to do the so what, and the so what relies upon a sort of a provocative question, and I wonder if now we need to be asking, so what about the strikes, right? In the last sort of concentration of rail strikes, there was a lot of column inches about, well, they're not cutting through because of working from home, and people have despaired of they're not particularly against Mick Lynch and the rail workers, but they've despaired of getting anywhere on time, but it doesn't matter because the world's changed, because you can just call in from your laptop. And I wonder, with the ambulance workers and the nurses, they're exacerbating a chronic problem that was already there.
Yep.
We've been used to headlines about ambulance queues, about ambulance response times for years and
Black
years
alerts
and
and hospitals
years,
full.
regardless of industrial action. So I just...
That's their argument as well. That's the
Whose argument?
The nursing and the ambulance unions, they say, even if we weren't striking, it's shit. So, sorry. But that's how they say it in what was that? That's my pen, I think. I think that's what they basically... Thanks, Charles. I think that's basically their argument is, I just got an email from the Royal College of Midwives because they just said, we're just relying on agency staff. we can't provide, we're relying on the goodwill of midwives to even provide basic service. So, you know, where's the minimum safety requirements for the NHS? Is there actually one?
But then is there a way for us to cover it, to look at a sort of sector that hasn't really been in the news yet? For example, teachers. I'm thinking if that's a sector that hasn't got the same degree of the kind of chronic problems that the NHS has got, and a whole other load of issues. And given that it's going to affect so many people on the same day, if that is going to have the impact on public sentiment, could that be a turning point when either one or the other side realises that public leaders, if they stick with the teachers despite, you know, school closures, that maybe the government has to rethink? Or is that maybe, if they're all looking more at civil servants and kind of the hidden backlogs that are growing as a result of the civil servants going on strike, that you don't really see in the same way that you see nurses.
Yeah.
But you do notice when you can't get a driving licence or a passport, you have to wait for an autopsy or something like that, whether that's all related to this general sense of chaos.
On waiting.
Yeah.
I mean, to Liz's point on this moment that the government, governments have U-turned recently. So they could U-turn on this. But I actually think, you know, it's about negotiation as well. This is not about, it should be a negotiation. That's what's happened with the rail strikes. So
Jeevan, can I jump to you quickly, because I know you were mentioning Germany before and France, and just this different attitude towards disputes, labour disputes in general.
Yeah, sure. And I guess one thing that is interesting, Mark's question was basically about kind of why we don't talk about strikes and why we don't, and I suppose the question is really why we don't talk about unions. And there is a point here, isn't there, about kind of union power declining, and that's why we don't talk about it, because we're interested in power, and yet they're sort of needed more than ever almost, because inequality is greater than ever before, and sort of capital is kind of less restrained than ever before. And I guess, like, the point I was going to make about France and Germany is that they're kind of the opposite of each other, but they both sort of show something interesting about the relationship between unions and companies. In France, as we saw from that picture, the union is incredibly visible. They're actually incredibly powerless, which people often don't realise. In Germany, the unions are really quiet, and they're also really powerful. So in France, union membership is about 10% of the workforce. In Germany, it's something like 20%. The German model is based on unions collaborating with companies. There's something called Mitbestimmung in German, where they basically sit down and talk through how the business works together. Union members have seats on company supervisory boards. They have collective pay agreements. It doesn't always work, but when it does work, it's incredible. So I remember going to a German company, and I talked to the chief executive, and he said, "Oh, well, you must talk to the union guy as well." And I talked to the union guy, and he was like, "Yeah, let me take you through the business. This is how it works. This is how we become more profitable." And so they have a model where the union basically says, we want to avoid job cuts at all costs. So if you need to cut our pay, but don't fire anyone. Whereas what happens in France is that the unions make loads of noise. They're really good at getting people out on the streets, but they never get what they want, or pretty much hardly ever get what they want. And so I think like the sort of maybe the kind of like the deeper point here, or the thing we're sort of like trying to get to across this thinking is, you know, we're all obviously kind of every worker in every country in the world is kind of quite frustrated with their situation at the moment, feeling kind of relatively powerless, feeling like there's sort of increasing power going to the owners of machines, basically. We don't quite know how to fight back, and we're all kind of working towards an answer to this question, aren't we? I don't know what it is, but it's interesting to see that different countries have different versions of the answer.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Sorry, Amy.
Oh, we've moved on a bit, but just going back to the law that the government want to bring in, and it's going to the Lords and back. I just think the whole thing makes the government look so stupid, particularly around paramedics and nursing and the doctors who will go on strike in March for a 72-hour walkout, because they're already at the minimum, like below the minimum staffing level that's required. I mean, nurses are being like rotated in to work in corridors. That's the place that they need to be for that shift, and patient safety is already really poor and not there. So I don't know, it just makes them seem really out of touch.
I think Kat's point was about is a strong, makes them
yes,
stronger.
She was saying
right?
that it's the political. They think it's sending the political signal that they're taking the fight to the unions. That they have to do something, and they're not willing to negotiate on pay because they are trying to rectify their reputation as being fiscally competent. So they're just saying they don't have the money to spend, and that's non-negotiable. Which means that, but they have to do something. So what's the answer? They kind of put through this strike legislation that doesn't look to me as well, like Liz, I can't see the logic behind it from a practical point of view, but I think it's more the signal that they're trying to send. I think it's the same with, you can see in their kind of migration policies at the moment. A lot of them don't seem, to me anyway, to be workable in practice, but it's the signal that they're trying to send out to their voters that they are being tough and they are taking action. Is my reading of it.
I read, I think it was in The Guardian, Steve Barclay privately conceded that he'll have to give money, he will give money to nurses, but he's been told that he has to find that within
his budget,
his own budget.
Yeah, I saw that.
And that the public support for them is a lot greater than maybe for train strikes.
Yeah, and the railway workers as opposed to the drivers, that's the only area I've seen even a whiff of reporting that they might be coming to a deal, and that's with a 9% pay increase over 2 years. I think it's kind of 4% and then 5%. But the significance there as well is that, as Phoebe said earlier, a lot of the dispute, particular to railway workers, is the change to kind of conditions and concerns over job security as the whole railway tries to modernise. So I think one thing the government took off the table was this idea that train drivers would have to operate the doors, which just was an absolute red line. So they've said they've backed away from that request, and so there is that will seem
that's
to
a
be
negotiation.
A discussion, but that's not been accepted. That's negotiation.
Yeah, that's how negotiation works.
The unions seem to be saying is that they just don't have a partner on the other side of the table, and I don't know how true that is, but there doesn't seem to be that kind of compromise even trying to be reached.
Pat Collins, that's exactly what she said. Her and the reason, and also I think from what I could see, there's a really brilliant piece by Zoe Williams in The Guardian where she interviewed Pat Collins, which is worth a read. As you know, she was very happy to come to the table. They come with their binders, they come with their knowledge, they've spoken to their members, they're at the table to have a negotiation, and Steve Barclay gets up and goes away after 10 minutes. Like and then they're briefing against each other in the media. And to me, I know we talked about the Royals, it feels similar to that. It feels like they're briefing against each other, they don't really know how to play it, and then it's like, it's really hard to know what's actually going on and to pull apart what's happening. So, yeah.
Sarah wanted to.
Thanks, Phoebe. I just had a question for you guys in regards to what Amy was saying about the strike laws, which is, do you think that this is we're starting to see a worldwide trend in anti-strike legislation being passed? Because I'm just thinking in the US last week, the Supreme Court heard arguments about labor disputes that, if they side with the company, could sort of overwrite laws that have been in effect in 60 years and could basically end the right to strike in the US forever.
That's going through now?
Yeah, so I believe the arguments closed January 10th, and they haven't given an opinion yet, and they haven't said when they're going to give an opinion. So the case, it's about whether or not, if you're on strike, if you destroy property or cause a significant enough financial loss by your striking, that they can say you're not going to be allowed to. And then obviously the thinking is a company can always say, this will cause us financial loss, so we're not going to let you strike. I mean, I guess the US and the UK both having these things come up for dispute isn't necessarily a trend, but I was just wondering, do you think that there is a worldwide trend that is kind of just anti-labor?
I don't have an answer to that one, but I didn't know the details about the US case, and it's something that's an area we could definitely look at. That's a really useful point. Feeds into what Jeevan was saying earlier as well about this is a kind of worldwide issue of just inequality and people wondering how they can try and fight back a little bit and how different governments are responding. Any other? Yes.
My point's going back to the very original question, which is Britain on strike, has the government lost control? Is the government not very, very much in control of this as a tool to manipulate the media or public opinion to recreate a conflict between the government and the unions, to reignite a lot of memories in a certain part of the electorate who remember it? They are very much the ones with the power to settle a lot of these disputes, most of them being government-paid jobs. And as Kat indicated earlier on, it's been foreseeable for quite some time. We were talking about the next winter of discontent last winter, I think, as everyone could see it coming, and is it not being, I don't know, from the political end of things over there, whether it's not being very much manipulated quite deliberately in order to, as a smokescreen for the problems of the recent past, for the Conservatives to throw it all back at Labour as
so you mean
you
think
and the unions.
So you think the Conservatives are briefing the media to try and turn public opinion against the strikes as a way of?
Or they're hoping that public opinion will turn against the strikes. I don't know about the briefing within the media, but hoping that it would make public opinion turn against those who are on strike, because we're all suffering from the cost of living. I still need to see a GP kind of attitude. We haven't really kind of looked into how much this is really being manipulated and quite deliberately created, this impasse that keeps it going.
Thank you. Any other thoughts or questions, or in particular, how do we do this? We've got this idea of trying to get inside some kind of war room. Is there someone coordinating this, trying to get inside the unions as to how they're trying to enact a response? Possibly something from inside government looking at what the sort of underlying strategy is behind this that kind of can help try and explain things like the anti-strikes bill that doesn't make logical sense from the outside at the moment. Trying to get more comparisons as to a general sort of global, or any data on kind of more global anti-strike legislation movement. The question over whether different countries have much better strategies in terms of which unions are powerful, powerless, and visible, and yes.
I'd be interested to know, do strikes work and who they work for?
Yeah.
So it looks like they work in transport, doesn't look like they work in healthcare.
But nurses have never tried before.
True. Or
lecturers, it's not working.
Or education looks like it doesn't work. And I'd just be like, it'd be interesting to sort of see if they work compared to how they used to work.
Yeah. Okay. That feeds to the quote that you put up earlier. Like, what other option is there? Hi, Sue.
I'm wondering if the economic disruption of strikes is something that could be of interest to the government more than the kind of human dimension of it. Obviously, it's very dehumanizing to talk about strikes in economic terms, but I'm thinking that maybe, I wonder if the train strikes, for example, got more of an effect because of the economic value of it, economic loss of those kinds of strikes. I don't know if this is true, but getting data on it could be interesting.
Looking at the economic cost of the different sectors going on strike.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
I do seem to remember that the government did admit that if they had, it would have been cheaper for them to
settle with the railway strike workers, yes.
It's like $1 billion or something, yeah.
So he said, I think, yes, he said exactly that. Hugh Merriman, he said it would have been cheaper to just call it a day and give them what they wanted, but the reason they couldn't is because of these changes to working conditions that they see as essential to any ultimate deal.
If you look at it,
but from a purely economic, yes.
It's
they've lost
25 million on a weekday and 15 million a day at the weekend.
Well, I think Royal Mail said today they've lost £200 million so far because of strikes.
They've also lost a lot of mail.
They've also lost a lot of mail. Yeah. Economic impact of Christmas presents didn't reach destination.
I was wondering if there are any other metrics other than real-time pay cuts. So I remember I heard a midwife speak, and she was saying that she don't take the figures, but she used to care for like one patient every X hours, and now it's 5, and jumping between wards, and maybe teachers have similar metrics as well.
Thank you.
The government are aware of the labour shortage, which would be another sort of element of taking power away if they were interested in diminishing the leverage of the striking workers. Then you would seek to do everything you could to fill the vacancies. If I worked that out right. So this half-assed thing they've announced, was it today, yesterday? The thing about we're going to give tax breaks to the over 50s and send letters to economically inactive women. I'm thinking, I'm not sure that's definitely the right approach. But this is the thing. It just feels to me the outcome for the economy, to your point, and for the country and to individual people's lives, is all really serious. Like it's a grave situation.
Yeah.
And yet the government response seems to be. Like it doesn't feel like there's a sort of great deal of panic or concern, or you don't feel like you've got all your best brains thinking, God, we really, really can't afford to do this, so we're going to have to really think through with some amazing ideas of how we can. You don't get the sense that that's happening at all, which is why I wonder if they're just waiting it out.
So there's a Treasury workforce plan for the NHS. There's a workforce plan for the NHS. There is a workforce plan apparently, and it's sat in Treasury, and the word was it was going to be before Christmas. Hasn't appeared, and it's still sat in Treasury. And I think someone alerted to us. It wasn't a direct. A member kind of flagged it to us, and then I've kind of done my research, and maybe we can dig further on that. I think you'd have to speak to someone in Treasury who've obviously had a leadership change, civil servant wise, and I don't know what's happening there. But there is meant to be this workforce plan, but because they're sitting on it. So I think there might be ideas, and then they're being kind of blocked at this level, and I wonder if that's top down or a lack of ideas bottom up. And I think that maybe if we could see the workforce plan, we might be able to work out. Or maybe it's bad. I can imagine it would have come from the Department of Health because it's NHS workforce plan.
Right.
It's long-term strategy.
How to fill the gaps in the workforce in the NHS.
Yeah, is the idea. I mean, hypothetically, maybe they haven't got a plan. But that's that one piece of something that could make a difference. But again, it might be, I don't know where that blocker is. And obviously that's not including teachers or fair workers or any of the rest of the labour shortages we've got in terms of long-term sickness. So that's just the NHS. Was it anyone else? A hand up?
One question. Do we have a ThinkIn planned with an employer or a minister and a union boss on that so far? If not, should we?
Sorry, can I jump in, Mark? Because Zav did a Sensemaker audio on the rail strikes, and I can't remember which union it was, but they had listened to it and said, they wrote in, I think maybe to Zendesk or something, and said, oh, we'd love to tell you more about like what we're doing and stuff.
Yeah, they could come in and...
The rail delivery. Yeah.
The rail delivery group.
But that could be a start. Okay.
Great.
The short answer is yes.
We'll make that happen.
Charles, we've got that good information that can you see Paul Novak?
Paul Novak? But I guess, what are we asking when we do it?
Okay, good question. I mean, do we have to come up with a question that is equally pointed for each side? Or...
not necessarily, but I think...
Do strikes still work?
Do strikes work? Like you said, seems like the simplest one to try and get them all to answer.
Okay. Sophie said, how can strikes work better?
How not? Yeah. Are there any Are there any unions that you think have done particularly well during the most recent round of negotiations, and ones which perhaps have made errors along the way?
I mean, I think the point that they aren't having negotiations, but which is why I think they've gone to the media. Like, ideally, and I don't know, Jeevan, maybe if you know more about this, this kind of, it's like where the unions sit. I think we've become quite comfortable, and maybe Mick Lynch is down to that, with the kind of the media, the government, the union, and how they kind of brief back and forth. Often when they're doing their little spot, they're on a picket line and they're kind of coming in from the picket line. But, where's the reporter that's kind of there who's then doing that? Labour's not turning up on the picket lines. There was that kind of whole issue there. So I don't know how to measure the success. I think that's where, Mick Lynch has done very well for his own. He's done quite well in terms of that. I mean, Pat Cullen is doing an excellent job for the first time as a union striking. She's really put herself out there, but they've gone nowhere with Steve Barclay. So what
success?
What's success there?
Yeah.
So I don't know if you have thoughts on that, Jeevan, but
I guess it feels like the obvious things are kind of looking at membership and looking at whether whether they're achieving their sort of stated objectives.
Yeah.
Those two things would be interesting to measure. And also maybe kind of like thinking about how the economy is shifting and whether there are sections of it that aren't unionised. I mean, Amazon, I think, is like the big example, right, where there is a union, but it isn't recognised. So.
Yeah, and this is private-public as well, so, you know, like Royal Mail is a tricky one because the CWU, their dispute is quite bad. These kind of bosses that have been parachuted into Royal Mail and what they want to do, and they want it to be more like Amazon. That's why they're disputing. It's because they don't want to become gig economy, kind of paid per parcel. They want to kind of keep their usual route. They want to keep that traditional format, and they don't want to move forward with it. So that might be a way to do that one.
Thank you. Does anyone have any final points, questions, thoughts, ideas to sort of pitch in before we wrap up?
Is there still such a thing as ACAS? Because I remember from my youth, showing my age again, whenever there was a big union dispute, there was the conciliation service ACAS would always be where the union met with the bosses and they tried to bash heads together and come up with a plan.
Yeah.
As like a negotiation, like someone to sit on the table with them.
It was the conciliation service ACAS. It was.
ACAS.
Yeah.
I haven't read about it though, as being a player.
It sounds like it's just usually them sitting at a table with Steve Barclay or
But if
whoever.
there isn't one, why not anymore? When it used to actually be the table at which solutions kind of were formed.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Thank you. Thank you everyone so much for all of your contributions. It's been brilliant. I think we've clearly got a lot of newsroom experience with people who are going on strike, so please can I ask, as sort of weeks and months progress, if you have got, if you're talking to relatives, friends, contacts that you know who are going on strike or planning to, please do keep feeding in what they're saying and what you're hearing to the mega desk and to the podcast team as well to see what we can do with that. We can look and see if we can work out who is coordinating, if there is such a thing happening, and try and get inside the war room. We can try and get more data on things other than wage change, but look at people who aren't just in the striking section, people on the minimum wage, just to get an idea of who else has been affected by real-time pay cuts and the impact that's had. We can look at how other countries are going through similar legislation and how unions are generally just different in how they are structured and how that manages sort of workforce relations. Question of do strikes work, which could be a possible sense maker, but it looks like it will be lined up as a ThinkIn. We can try and get maybe act as the independent arbiter and bash some heads together to see if we can get them to agree an answer. Looking at lots more data that the sense maker team can pick up, looking at the economic cost of different sectors on strikes and the metrics of strike action. And then I think this idea of looking at unions and who's seen a boost in membership as a way of measuring who's having the best kind of period of getting people behind their cause is a really good way to look at that as well.
I'm just going to chip in because there's someone called AP Pool who's on, that's their name said, and sorry, we missed this, but they've just said that they work as a HR professional specialising in managing employment, industrial relations. It'd be great to talk to you. It sounds like what we need. And to answer the question, the government has to a large extent lost control, mainly due to the lack of expertise and experience in dealing and negotiating with unions, kind of to our point. In turn, this has been fueled by an ideological historical resistance to engage with unions and unionism. The government appears out of their depth. So I think maybe that is this point that we've kind of said about, are we really prepared? You know, the government now is not the government of the 70s, and did they really know how to negotiate? Does Steve Barclay really know how to negotiate with the union effectively and work with Treasury to kind of pull together finances?
This is not the 1980s. Yeah. Great. Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon.
Thanks for watching that video. There's plenty more over on our channel, so just click here to subscribe.